Hello, and welcome to another episode of It's a History Podcast. I am your host, Madison, and in this week's episode, we are taking a look as to why Washington, D.C. is our nation's capital. Let's get right into it. When looking at the history of the United States, coming together as a democracy with an elected president instead of being ruled by a king and a monarchy, the setup for the capital had to be different. In a country where monarchy and king still ruled, the capital would be where the monarchy was located and work out around their home. In the earlier look as to what the nation would become, it was soon realized that the capital city would need to be a federal city, not a city that was controlled by a state or government, so that no one state would have more of an advantage over the other states. The framers of the Constitution left the actual location of the capital city out of the Constitution, but did clarify that Congress should have the power to, quote, exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district not exceeding 10 miles square, as may by cession of particular states and the acceptance of Congress become the seat of the government of the United States. Prior to our capital being located in Washington, D.C., our capital was actually located in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. But why did we move the capital from Philadelphia to Washington, D.C.? That would be thanks to the Residence Act of July 16, 1790. Moving the nation's capital to Washington, D.C., which is located in more of a central location along the East Coast, was an act to appease the southern states, who worried about the longevity of slavery, feared that having the nation's capital in the northern city of Philadelphia would lead to the future presidents being too sympathetic to the abolitionists. Split between the North and the South, Alexander Hamilton and the North wanted the newly established federal government to take on the Revolutionary War debts, and Thomas Jefferson and the southern states wanted to have the capital placed in a location that would be friendly to slaveholders. So, as a way to keep the new country together, the capital was moved. But as we know, this would not be the first nor the last compromise made to appease the southern slaveholding states and the continuation of slavery. Prior to this Residence Act going into effect, there had been some discontentment with the capital being located in Philadelphia. Before Washington, D.C. had been chosen, Philadelphia had been the place where the important decisions were being made, and it would be noted that it was also equally accessible to both the North and the South during this time period. In 1783, Continental soldiers who had yet to be paid for their time in the Revolutionary War marched to Philadelphia. Congress sent out Alexander Hamilton to talk to the soldiers, and eventually he convinced the soldiers to free Congress of this hostage situation so that the lawmakers could come together and quickly come up with a deal about repaying the troops. This was actually a problem with the original framework of the American government under the Articles of Confederation. Because of the way the articles were designed, Congress actually lacked the power to tax or compel states to provide funds, which in turn severely limited in the federal government's ability to pay the troops from the Revolutionary War. Hamilton, after his quick chat with the troops outside the door, did eventually send a note to the Pennsylvania state government where he actually requested that the governor send out state militiamen to protect the Congress from the federal militia. The governor declined to provide the state militiamen for this purpose. While all of this is going on, the members of Congress actually snuck away to Princeton, New Jersey, and proceeded to travel to various cities throughout the year, including Trenton, New Jersey, Annapolis, Maryland, and New York City. In 1787, congressional delegates returned back to Philadelphia to draft the new Constitution, the Constitution we still govern ourselves with today, where they addressed the concerns from the earlier situation. And while the decision was made that the capital would be relocated to an, at the time, undeveloped area along the Potomac, the city of Philadelphia would remain the capital city for an additional 10 years. President Washington and President John Adams lived in what is described as a modest house in Philadelphia near the area where Congress was located. Philadelphia would remain the nation's capital up until June 11, 1800. Let's look at the creation of Washington, D.C., because unlike some other capital cities, Washington, D.C. was a highly planned city. It would actually be George Washington himself that would pick the spot along the Potomac. The land that would eventually become Washington was originally inhabited by two different Native American villages, one being the Natochtank village that was a major trading center, the other being the Namaroquina. 40 years after first contact by Europeans, the land was home to only a quarter of the Native Americans that resided here in 1608. In our present day, there are about 4,000 Native Americans that live in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. would be established as the nation's capital by the Constitution of the United States. And Washington, after picking the land for the capital, appointed Pierre Charles L'Enfant to design the city. The location of the new capital city was announced January 24, 1791. L'Enfant presented a bold modern city reminiscent of his native Paris. The capital would be planned on a grid system, with the capital being in the center. The young city would eventually be burned in the War of 1812 with the newly completed White House, the Capitol, and the Library of Congress, with all of its books burned to the ground. Thomas Jefferson did later replenish the library by selling his own personal library for $23,950 in 1815. After the War of 1812, the city remained relatively small, especially when it came to permanent residents. And it would actually get even smaller when the Virginia Peace was retroceded after the voters in Alexandria elected to leave D.C. They felt as if the development on their side of the river had been neglected. It wouldn't be until the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation that the city would start to grow. The enslaved population in Washington had been emancipated on April 16, 1862, 9 months prior to the official Emancipation Proclamation, which led to Washington being a hub for the newly freed slaves. Also during the war, there had been a substantial buildup in the military surrounding the capital, and this buildup in the military led to the federal government growing around this administration. After the Civil War, the capital absorbed Georgetown and the surrounding rural areas that were outside the original plans made by L'Enfant. In 1901, the decision was made to fully complete L'Enfant's original designs. This completion meant that there was a redesign and an expansion of the National Mall, and the city itself continued to expand well into the 20th century. Did you know that while it's the nation's capital, the citizens of Washington, D.C. actually lack full self-governance? The citizens of Washington, D.C. are limited to a non-voting delegate in the House of Representatives. It wouldn't even be until 1964 that the citizens of Washington, D.C. would allow to vote in a presidential election, and its first mayor was elected in 1973. And with that, that's where I'm going to end today's episode. Sources for today's episode include an article from the National Constitution Center titled How Philadelphia Lost the Nation's Capital to Washington, an article from the White House Historical Association titled Where, Oh Where Should the Capitol Be? The Seat of the Government and Expanding Nation by Robert Grogg. Thank you for listening to this week's episode. If you liked what you heard, head over to Spotify or Apple Podcasts and leave a review. If you have any questions, comments, or topic ideas, you can email me at itsahistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can also find me over on Instagram and Threads. Thank you again for listening to this week's episode, and I hope to have you in the next one.